Well, welcome to all those on this call, the Hackworth Fellows Showcase for the 2021 group of terrific Hackworth Fellows at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, the home of the 2021 national champions in women's soccer, decided really just a few minutes ago back in North Carolina. So we consider that our group of fellows here really stand in the tradition of the outstanding students who just won the national championship, and this is another great group of outstanding Santa Clara students. My name is David DeCosse. I'm the Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, where I also serve as the Director of Campus Ethics. The Hackworth Fellowship program has been in existence since 2002 and was established by a very generous grant from Michael and Joan Hackworth, who have been long time and wonderful supporters of Santa Clara University. In keeping with the theme of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, all of the Hackworth Fellowships focus on different themes and topics in applied ethics. For us, it's very important to study more theoretical matters in ethics, but our focus is on how these ideas cash out in real life, because we believe ethics isn't just something for study. It makes a huge difference in all of our lives, all of the time. So you will hear from our fellows about this applied dimension of ethics in all of their projects across many different fields kind of here at the university. So here's how this event will proceed. We are going to have presentations from all of our fellows, and they will be 5-minute maximum presentations. We do have a question and answer option. If you're interested in posting a question, we will get that and have a chance to perhaps pose that to a fellow. We will have time, we trust, at the end of all of their presentations to field more questions. So please consider them and direct them in the box for questions to an individual fellow, or I invite you to address them to the whole team as well, if you wish. So we'll jump in here right away and get started and go in procession here. And we'll begin with our first presentation, which is by Amana Liddell. Amana worked with Dr. Margaret McLean, who's been for many years the Director of Bioethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. Amana is a double major in biology and psychology from Seattle, Washington. So Amana, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Koss. So first of all, thank you for everyone for being here this evening. Within the field of healthcare ethics, this year I have dedicated my time as a Hackworth Fellow to looking into the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and its effect on the Black community. And so coming into this fellowship, my overall goal was to better understand healthcare disparities as multifaceted issues with multiple contributing factors, but also understanding how important it is to disentangle what we can about healthcare disparities. In the first couple months of the pandemic prior to applying for this fellowship, it became glaringly apparent that existing healthcare disparities have resulted in and were perpetuated in the face of COVID-19. And so as the number of cases and hospitalizations and deaths were all disproportionate within the Black community. And so this is what sparked the inspiration for my project. And so while this was the focus of my project, I found it impossible to talk about today's healthcare disparities without acknowledging how past instances of medical racism and biases have gotten us here today. And so from situations of using Black individuals as experimental subjects throughout the development of Western medicine, and instances of the United States Public Health Services study of untreated syphilis in Mason County, and the story of Henrietta Lacks, medical mistrust has arisen within the Black community over numerous instances, but this medical mistrust has persisted into today, where it stems from people's contemporary experiences of discrimination within the healthcare field, in addition to these historical issues of mistreatment. And so these contemporary experiences today include things like inequity to access to healthcare insurance, healthcare facilities, and treatments, which are all institutional practices that make it more difficult for Black Americans to obtain care. In the face of COVID-19, these existing healthcare disparities have led to a greater prevalence of pre-existing conditions within the African American community. And additionally, these compounded socioeconomic issues have resulted in African Americans being at a higher risk of exposure to COVID-19 due to making up a larger percentage of the essential workforce and minority neighborhoods having greater infection rates. Then when we get into issues like addressing vaccine hesitancy within the Black community, it's important to consider the reasoning behind a person's concern, which is something that I've really taken away from this fellowship. And so looking at the figure at the bottom of my slide, there's a relationship between the confidence in vaccine efficacy and safety and one's intentions, where African Americans are nearly twice as likely to get the vaccine when they are at least somewhat confident that it's been tested among members of their racial group. So being seen and heard is very important for the efficacy of vaccine delivery as well, not just the vaccine itself. This highlights a key point of my learning over this past year, that healthcare disparities are rooted in so much more than historically based medical mistrust. And it's even harmful to attribute these instances of vaccine hesitancy within the Black community to just mistrust alone. And we have to address the structural concerns to increase vaccine compliance within the Black community and to move forward from this pandemic. And so as we progress away from masks and other public health measures, we have to keep in mind that even with the increased availability of vaccines, disparities will still persist and may widen if the underlying drivers of vaccine adoption and variation across the population are not addressed. My research over this past year has led me to create an infographic and a series of short videos that will hopefully be released soon, with the goal of delivering this important information that I've summarized here tonight. And that all that is information that is important for reaching the goal of delivering and mediating vaccine hesitancy within the Black community, but also providing everyone within the general public with information about healthcare disparities, specifically those that we've seen during COVID-19, because I have determined that healthcare disparities are an issue that cannot be fought by one community alone, but only all of us together, as they are a deep-rooted societal issue. Thank you all for your time, and I would love any questions should you have any.
Thank you so much, Amana. Let me ask you a question here. What would you say to a Black American who knows of your study, who came up to you and said, I hear this, I'm still afraid to get vaccinated? What is your response?
Yeah, I would say kind of one thing for me, kind of in the beginning of vaccine rollout that made a difference for me was knowing that there is an unlikely theoretical risk associated with the vaccine, but there is a likely risk of COVID and having adverse effects and long-term effects of COVID-19. And so when we're looking at those two odds, that's a big thing that makes a difference for me. And then another thing is that I've kind of learned about this lack of trust in the medical system is that it can either be harmful in causing people to avoid care, or it can be empowering by encouraging people to pursue health system reform and a broader social change. And so for me, I've chosen to kind of take the empowering stance. And so I would encourage others to do the same in taking charge of their own health and advocating for themselves. And getting vaccinated is definitely one of the best ways you can do that right now.
Well, Amana, thank you so much. And this is obviously such timely and important work. And we're really so happy that you could do this and bring this message out to the community. And also, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we will go on to our next presentation now. And this presentation will be by Abigail Favinsky. And Abby worked with me in my capacity as Director of Religious and Catholic Ethics at the Ethics Center. And Abby is a double major in psychology and communication from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you, Professor DeCosse. And thank you everyone for coming. So my name is Abby, and as mentioned, I spent this year focusing on Catholic ethics and specifically ethics of hope. So as I was applying to the Hackworth Fellowship in the beginning of this year, it was also the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And there was a lot of instability between racial violence, inequality, and healthcare disparities, as Amana talked about. A lot of isolation and just general uncertainty surrounding school and work life. So I kind of found myself keep asking the question, is it even possible for people to find hope in such a turbulent time? And if so, what does that hope even look like? So fast forward a couple months when I was starting to work on the project, and my initial interest was actually in making the Catholic Church more accessible to young people. But in trying to come up with ideas for that theme, I kept really going back to the topic of how is hope even possible? How is hope even possible? And that really felt like a more primary concern at the time, which led me to create this social media campaign in which I asked my fellow Hackworth peers, what brings them hope on a college campus and how did they find hope? And their answers are very eye-opening to me. And it really solidified my desire to focus on the ethics of hope for my final presentation. And in working with Professor DeCosse, I was able to discover, research, and really get into the nitty-gritty of a wonderful book by a Jesuit educator and theologian, William F. Lynch. And his book is titled Images of Hope, Imagination as Healer of the Hopeless, and he is pictured in the slide. So this book takes the traditional Catholic understanding of hope as a theological virtue and adds a lot of important elements such as psychological and philosophical aspects of hope that are less talked about and more commonly misunderstood. So Lynch gives a lot of particular attention to these lesser known dimensions of hope, such as hope as very active, very creative, very integral to one's imagination, hope requiring a lot of patience and delayed gratification, and hope being especially prevalent in community life. He also speaks at length about how hope can be especially tricky, but still able to be manifested and accomplished by people living with mental illnesses and other individuals who are deeply marginalized at the time he was writing this in the 1960s. So as my deliverable for the Hackworth Fellowship, I decided to create a written reflection paper, which I will be submitting to the Jesuit Journal of Higher Education, both regarding my analysis of Lynch's work, my own perspectives of it, and relating it to the third Jesuit apostolic preference, which is to accompany youth in the creation of a hope-filled future. To myself, I see those ideas as very, very interrelated. So for my paper, I wanted to give specific attention to the college perspective. I believe in college, there's a lot of unique challenges to hope that can't be found in other aspects of life. And especially this past year, where those challenges have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and other COVID-related issues, such as a rising prevalence of mental health concerns in college-age individuals. But most importantly, I really wanted to touch on how all college students, regardless of their age, identity, or background, can tangibly practice hope and can call upon it as a constant and steadfast companion in the coming future, and however foreseeable or unforeseeable that future may be. So, in one thing in learning about Lynch and talking about hope that I really want college students to understand, this is just one of many, many, is that hope doesn't necessarily mean toxic optimism, and it doesn't mean ignoring all of the negative aspects of life, nor is it reserved for only of times of great distress. But rather, hope is a very everyday virtue that needs to be practiced and cultivated. Lynch goes so far as to believe that hope is best achieved when people work through the most painful and difficult parts of life, rather than just working around those parts of life. He holds that hopelessness is not the enemy of hope, but that apathy is. Hopelessness, which is this occasional feelings of being overwhelmed, can actually create a space of freedom and self-agency that allows hope to grow. So in a weird way, hope and hopelessness are really interdependent. And I think this is a very important point for college students to understand, because I have witnessed firsthand how young people can get very lost in feelings of apathy and really struggling to understand what the point of trying to make a change on a college campus is when you only have 4 years to do so. And I think it would be a terrible shame to misinterpret a brief, desperate moment as a failure to one's hope as a whole. So as a result, I think that classifying hope and hopelessness as merely two sides of the same coin is very essential for hope to thrive, and that it's very essential for college students to understand this and many other topics touched on Lynch and related to hope as a theological, psychological, and philosophical virtue, so that we can keep hoping rightly and create a more hope-filled future. Thank you.
Great, Abby. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering if you might unpack a little. So I'm a college student and I'm coming to you and you've just said hopelessness has some connection to hope, but I'm struggling to understand that. So why shouldn't I be so afraid of hopelessness?
That's a great question. So I draw on this distinction between apathy and hopelessness. And Lynch defines apathy as really almost sort of a death to hope, where it's completely giving up, showing no creativity and imagining anything else. Whereas hopelessness, though it kind of sounds pretty scary, as I said, it's almost essential in a very weird way, very essential for hope to thrive. And that hopelessness are these, it's a very inevitable occurrence. Like he uses the example of it is hopeless to believe that we will live forever. Hopelessness is just very natural and embedded in society. And with any hope that we're working towards, there will be obstacles in our way. And that is where Lynch at least sees hopelessness present. So as a college student, I would advise people to say, hope takes on a very realistic perspective and there will be obstacles to your path to hope. But rather than kind of get overwhelmed and have a sense of hopelessness in the face of these obstacles, it allows you to just kind of readjust your goals and your pathways into achieving hope. So in a very, as I said, a very interesting way, hopelessness really allows people to explore their freedom and readjust their plan to achieve their hope.
All right. Thank you so much, Abby, for those hopeful words in these tough times. Really.
Thank you so much.
All right, we will go on to our next speaker now, who is Alexandra George. And Allie worked with Joan Harrington, the Director of Social Sector Ethics at the Markkula Center. And Allie is a double major in philosophy and political science from Los Angeles. Allie, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. DeCosse, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming here tonight. After working on this for a year, it's so exciting to present it to other people and to share. I'm a philosophy major, so I'm really passionate about ethics and philosophy, and it's so nice to share it with other people. So for my Hackworth project, I looked at compassionate release, which based on the research, is an extraordinary and compelling problem. Compassionate release is a series of federal and state policies that release inmates from prison a little earlier than their sentences might normally allow due to extraordinary and compelling circumstances, including terminal illness, debilitating illness, and family emergencies, and really any extraordinary and compelling circumstance. I got this idea for this project last year. I was talking to someone who used to work at a halfway house, and they were describing some of the problems and challenges that inmates experienced upon reentry and release. And I thought about COVID-19 and the pandemic and recent discussion I'd heard about possibly using compassionate release to alleviate some of the problems that might cause prisons to become hotspots. And I wondered if those same problems would be apparent in compassionate release. So I did some research, and to my surprise, compassionate release was not granted all that much, and I started to wonder why. And this is a theme I'll return to. So taking a step back, compassionate release was first enacted at the federal level as a part of the Sentencing Reform Act. The Sentencing Reform Act was meant to be tough on crime and did things such as enact mandatory minimums. Now, when passing the First Step Act, Congress recognized that this would lead to unjust sentences. So it also created safety valves that courts could use to prevent such sentences, and compassionate release was meant to be one of these safety valves. However, if you look at the numbers, you'll see that this didn't quite work out the way Congress intended. As of 2019, there are about 1.5 million people incarcerated in state and federal prisons and jails in the US. This prison population is also rapidly aging. There has been a 150% increase in inmates between the ages of 55 and 65. At the same time, 49 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government have compassionate release policies. But despite this, only 0.01% of all federal prisoners received compassionate release between 1990 and 2000. And this was as a result of several administrative problems. The First Step Act, which was passed in 2018, was meant to alleviate some of these problems, and to some extent it was successful, but compassionate release is still a seldomly used tool, with only 145 petitions granted in 2019. So for my project, I decided to write an advocacy paper pulling from Western and non-Western philosophy to discuss the ethics of compassionate release. This paper is going to be put on the Ethics Center website, and in the meantime, if you'd like to read it, you can scan the QR code. I find that compassionate release is ethical according to Mencius, an ancient Chinese philosopher, Buddhist philosophy, and Aristotle's common good. And we seem to recognize this, considering that 49 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government all have compassionate release policies. And this raises the question, why are we not doing more to address the administrative burdens that prevent compassionate release, especially when many of these administrative burdens are easier to deal with relative to the many challenges that lawmakers face today? So I think my ultimate takeaway from this project is that change is within reach, so long as we recognize and act on the extraordinary and compelling nature of compassion, and as Brian Stevenson writes about in Just Mercy, reciprocal humanity. Thank you so much for your time, and I think we have time for a few questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Allie. Let me ask you this. I'm so interested, and I'm guessing others are too, your research into Mencius, Buddhist philosophy, and Aristotelian, Western kind of philosophy. Can you share with us anything that particularly struck you about points of comparison or contrast among those, say, those three sort of traditions of philosophy right there?
Yeah, the reason I chose to pull from Western as well as non-Western philosophy is I took a philosophy class on Chinese philosophy a few years back, and it was so interesting seeing philosophy from a non-Western perspective and getting that wider outlooks. That was something, that global perspective and diversity was something I wanted to bring to this project. I was surprised a little bit about how much all three philosophies agreed with compassionate release. I think one of the most interesting things was Buddhist philosophy is newer to me. I had not encountered it as much prior to this project. And there is an ancient Buddhist philosopher who actually wrote about compassionate release. He wrote extensively about punishment, and he talked about how compassionate release was ethical, that it was not right to hold people in prison who are dying, who are sick. I think also it's really interesting to see the different approaches to compassion as a part of what makes us human. So Aristotle focuses on human nature, and Mencius does to some extent as well, but he is a little different in the sense that for Aristotle, human nature is unchanging. It is what we are essentially. For Mencius, we are innately good, meaning we have a disposition to be more good than bad, but we can change. That's part of what makes his philosophy so good for compassionate release, that through compassion and through acting on this compassion, we can change and become better versions of ourselves.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Allie.
Thank you.
And for this wonderful work. And so we will go now to our next presenter, Ariana Sepulus. And unfortunately, Ariana cannot be with us tonight. She has a conflict that is truly immovable, and we wish so much she could be here. Ariana worked with Don Hyder, the executive director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and she is an economics major from Boulder, Colorado. And I wanted to just present and get Ariana's voice a little bit in the room here so you can see she was looking at data privacy regulation concerns and did a survey of students at Santa Clara to kind of probe what their thoughts are regarding the normative value they put on privacy, but really the normative value they put on, in a sense, convenience for using services that are asking us for data. So here's what Ariana mentioned to me in a note. It's a very brief thing. I want to read her words into our, so to speak, record tonight. She says, the top pie chart on the right there shows that students overwhelmingly value convenience over privacy when using the internet. The bottom chart shows that a majority of students are still somewhat or very concerned with data privacy online. The disconnect between our preference for convenience over privacy and our concern for data privacy online is known as the privacy paradox, and it poses a challenge for regulating data privacy online. Users want their data to be protected, but not if it comes at the expense of convenience online. So, Ariana, excellent work. We wish you could be with us, but it's great to have your voice in the room tonight. Okay, so let's go on to our next presenter, and that will be Courtney Davis. And Courtney worked with Sabu Vincent, the Director of Journalism and Media Ethics at the Markkula Center. And Courtney is a philosophy major from Washington State. Courtney, over to you.
All right, thank you, Dr. DeCosse. Yes, so as was mentioned, I worked with Subu, who's the Director of Media and Journalism Ethics at the Markkula Center, on issues related to Facebook and content moderation. And so the quote that you see on my slide here comes directly from Facebook's official community standards, which is basically like their constitution, their list of do's and don'ts, what kind of content they allow on their platforms, and what kind of content and behavior they don't allow on their platforms. And so in this quote, it's in an effort to prevent and disrupt real world harm, we do not allow any organizations or individuals proclaim a violent mission or engage in violence to have a presence on Facebook. And this comes specifically from their dangerous individuals and organizations policy, which was deployed recently in Facebook's decision to deplatform Donald Trump the day after the insurrection. And if you've been following the news on this at all, you know that the Oversight Board just released their analysis of the case, upholding Facebook's decision to suspend Trump's account, but also made some important critiques and laid out some policy recommendations that Facebook will be responding to within the next couple of months. And so this past year, Subu and I have been more or less tracking how Facebook and with the 2020 election. And we kind of suspected that because of this high risk context in this year, this election year, that Facebook and the decisions that it made in certain situations had the potential to impact the outcome of the election. And this is something that we've all watched unfold over the past several months. And because so many of these issues are multifaceted, complex, and involve a bunch of stakeholders, our approach is more or less to pick individual case studies and kind of nitpick them apart and see how Facebook was enforcing its own policies. And one thing that we found was that in nearly every case that we selected, Facebook had demonstrated a kind of marked internal inconsistency. So basically, their policies would recommend that they do one thing, and they did something completely different. So which is problematic for a lot of reasons, but it eliminates predictability and it allows large companies like Facebook to kind of create policies on the fly, or create arbitrary policies to handle situations that are otherwise unprecedented, but still have large and consequential impacts. And our research really culminated over the past couple of months in what I was just talking about with Facebook's decision to deplatform Trump. And Subu and I, just about a month ago, submitted a comment to the Oversight Board before they reviewed the case and urged them to ask Facebook questions about their design and their algorithm and what they would change so that in the future, if they did reinstate Trump's account, or even if they decided to uphold the suspension, what would they do to ensure that these kinds of problems didn't happen again. And then after we had spent so much time on this case, I ended up publishing, which you can see if you follow the links on this slide, an indictment of Facebook's post-by-post enforcement model, because it seemed, for lots of reasons that you can read about, and it's kind of difficult to condense into a 5-minute presentation, that Trump's account should have been handled and dealt with long before the day of the insurrection. And the model that they have, I have 1 minute left, the model that they have to evaluate individual posts isn't enough to capture the unfolding of dangerous narratives. And they're only equipped to handle individual posts, and they are incapable of capturing more nuanced rhetoric that happens across their platforms and can lead to things like the insurrection or these really violent outcomes. And so there are certain things about Facebook's design that need to be addressed. And we also talked about the necessity of Facebook conducting some sort of internal review to evaluate their own potential contribution to the escalation of violence in January, and be very open and transparent about this reflection and about how they plan to prevent these kinds of things in the future. And so overall, just calls for transparency and predictability, and to not have large companies like Facebook be creating arbitrary policies to handle situations that have grave consequences for the general public. And with that, I'll kind of wrap up. But if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer, because I know I touched on a lot of things.
Courtney, thank you so much, Courtney. And I also, as Courtney said, I invite questions. Please post them, and we can pose them as we go to our great students here. Courtney, question for you. Is the Facebook Oversight Board the solution to this problem? Yes, no, why not?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I mean, the Facebook Oversight Board is kind of like a novel addition to their system created by Facebook itself. But they're only really equipped to handle cases that are presented to them. And they don't actually have the, like, for example, in this case, they can make policy recommendations to Facebook, but they're not binding. And so Facebook, within the next 6 months, has to respond to the issue of Trump's account. Whether or not it'll be reinstated, they have to decide if they will permanently suspend his account or apply a time-bound restriction to the indefinite suspension, so people know when it will be reinstated and when it will not be reinstated. But the Oversight Board also, in their review, developed, which you can read on their website, like a laundry list of policy recommendations that deal with things like internal consistency, things like their design, things that Facebook should do internally to improve their the enforcement gap and to improve all of these other things going on with Facebook. But Facebook does not have to respond to those recommendations. And so there are limitations to what the Oversight Board can actually do to solve these problems. But at least in cases like this, the fact that they exist is calling attention to problems and ensuring that more concrete decisions are made by Facebook, and that they have to publish certain kinds of justifications for decisions that are made like this. which isn't something that has happened in the past. And so it's a step forward, but I do think it's only going so far, if that makes sense.
It does make sense in an immensely complex matter. So thank you so much, Courtney, for your terrific work on this. All right, we will go to our next presentation now, and this will be by Julian Dreiman. And Julian worked with Professor Brian Greene, who was the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center. And Julian's interests at Santa Clara have really centered on the intersection of artificial intelligence and society. He is from Boulder, Colorado. Over to you, Julian.
Thanks, Dr. DeCosse. And I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone for being here tonight. It's really great to see all your faces. And also thank you to the Hackworth family for making this fellowship possible, and everyone at the Markkula Center for helping us along this strange but eventful year of being Hackworth Fellows. So like Dr. DeCosse mentioned, I worked with Dr. Brian Greene on the technology ethics side of things. And I kind of had two parallel projects going on throughout the year. One of them was researching robots used in elder care, as well as sending a survey to the student body to get opinions about personal data collection and AI ethics. So I'll quickly start by touching on my research into care bots and specifically deception. So here's a stat for all of you. By 2050, the population of Americans who will be 65 years and older is going to be 88 million. This is the baby boomer generation growing old. And there's also going to be a caregiving void. Right now, only about 20% of older adults age in the care of professional caregivers, and about 80% age with the care of informal caregivers. And these informal caregivers are just friends and family who in 2017 spent 34 billion hours, which was valued at $470 billion, working for these older adults. So with this caregiving void and the increase in older adults, there's going to be a need to somehow care for older adults. And this is where care bots or robots who do care come in. So there's so many ethical considerations when it comes to care bots, but what Dr. Greene and I focused on was deception. So how we started was looking at traditional bioethics and what bioethics says about deception. And there's kind of two ways to look at deception. One of them is from like this rule-based form of ethics called deontology, which says that lying is never okay. And this would inform that caregivers and care bots should never lie to their patients. But there's another type of ethics that is utilitarian and says that lying is okay in certain circumstances when it increases the overall positive outcome. So taking these ethical considerations into consideration when looking at care bots, we decided to think of some scenarios and create a matrix that would help us decide when deception was okay for care bots. So one scenario would be when perhaps a demented older adult asks for their deceased older parents, and they say, when is mom and dad coming to visit? So in this scenario, it would be okay for the care bot to deceive the older adult because one, asking for the older adult's parents doesn't really have a large impact on their care outcome. You know, if their parent is dead or not doesn't change the fact of their overall care. And then also, if someone has a very low cognitive capacity, they're not going to remember being deceived. That lowers the bar for deception. But that being said, we decided the deception should really be the last resort for care bots when they're interacting with older adults. And they should instead perhaps give a non-answer or just kind of work around the question and not even give an answer at all. So in the end, care bots should not really be deceptive, but in the end, they may need to be deceptive in some circumstances. So we also sent out this survey to the entire Santa Clara student body, talking about questions related to AI ethics and also questions related to personal data. So some interesting statistics that we got in relation to personal data were one, that 89% of students were concerned at the were concerned at the rate of the collection of their personal data. They also, 88% of them said that they believe that the federal government should have some role in regulating the collection, use, and sale of personal data. 82% believed that the collection of personal data should be regulated as something as a human right, as should be personal digital privacy. And lastly, only 32% of students took many steps to ensure that their digital privacy was protected while online. So this represents the privacy paradox. In relation to AI ethics, there were also several interesting responses. One of them was Santa Clara students' decision and preference of equity over equality. Now, equity means that everyone has the same outcome not equality, which means that everyone is treated the same way. So 69% of Santa Clara students believe that AI should strive for equity in their outcomes over equality. Again, 70% of students believe that AI will generally help society over the next 20 years, not hurt it. And we also discovered an interesting kind of mismatch in moral responsibility and moral status. 69% of students believe that AI will become as intelligent as humans are currently today in the next 20 years. However, 71% believe that if AI did become as intelligent as humans, that they should not have a similar moral status as humans. So this kind of brings an interesting question of how should AI be morally responsible? And lastly, we found that students really wanted certain human tasks to be maintained and done by humans rather than AIs. So for example, 82% of students believe that tasks such as evaluating a professor's quality and effectiveness should be done by humans, not by AI. So overall, we found these interesting statistics saying that most people have a generally positive view of AI. However, there are general concerns. So just to conclude, Dr. Green and I talked about or researched care bots and deception. We also sent out this survey to the entire student body, touching on questions of personal data collection and also questions relating to AI ethics. So I now going to conclude and take any questions that anyone has. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Julian. Let me follow up. You know, you started with care bots and then where you were ending about sort of what tasks AI can do. So where are you? Are you bullish on the possibilities for AI being a care bot to actually transmit care, not just provision, but a real human sense of care to a patient or not? Where do you stand in terms of the potential for AI in effect, mediating a human sense of care to a patient?
Yeah, that's a great and super important question. And I think that AI is actually already giving care to older adults and regular patients every day. For example, a lot of older adults have these companion care robots that don't necessarily speak, but they kind of cuddle with the older adults and give them a nice glance and kind of move around when they're talked to. So they are able to give the older adults companionship. And because there's this caregiving void, there's not enough caregivers for the amount of older adults that there are. These robots are filling a need to give give the older adults someone to interact with and talk to. So it's important to distinguish that CareBot care and human care will never be the same, but it's also important to recognize that CareBots will play a role in caregiving in the future, and that we should accept that, yes, CareBots can give an important type of care, however, it won't be human care.
Thank you so much, Julian. This is cutting edge of our world. So thank you so much and great job. All right, we will now go to our next presenter. And this is Lily Evans. And Lily worked with Anita Varma, our Assistant Director of Journalism and Media Ethics. And Lily is a double major in poli-sci, political science, journalism from Seattle, Washington. So over to you, Lily.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you everyone for being here. My Hackworth project, How They See Us, consists of 3 separate resources which attempt to address this growing disconnect between journalists and digital natives through a wider application of ethical considerations and media literacy skills. Unlike previous generations, digital natives interact with the news and other forms of media as both consumers and creators. And this style of engagement ultimately assigns responsibility to every participant in the media landscape to uphold and critique our standards for ethical communication. In general, our entrance into this predominantly digital environment has changed our relationship to journalism and the news. And it asks us to define the type of participant we want to be in this new, dynamic, expressive environment. I chose this project in part to better understand the role that journalists and media outlets play in the digital age, but also to address the public's recent concerns about trusting information online. As a journalist and a digital native myself, I am acutely aware of the role that I fill as both a producer of news and a consumer of it. I chose to highlight this consumer creator perspective in the effort to empower my peers to search the internet for news, find comfort in navigating online news, and commit to improving our collective digital space with their own contributions. So my first module is Journalism 101, which explains what journalism is. It goes over some of the ethics of journalism and the standards that professional journalists must uphold. And it also discusses the role of the First Amendment in news media in the US. The second module discusses modern media structures, first explaining what news and mass media looked like before the rise of the internet, and then discussing its turning point in 2008. We kind of then make key distinctions between mass media and digital media, explain a few key challenges associated with digital media, and end with a discussion on the kind of general financial insecurity of news organizations. The final module is on influence and persuasion, which explains what media messages are, how messages connect to agenda setting, and how media messages can exert social, political, and cultural influence. And all of these resources will be free and open to the public on the Markkula website, available for any student, educator, or other person who is interested in finding resources on how to navigate digital spaces. That's what I've got for you.
Lily, thank you so much. So 2008, tell us more about why that's such a significant turning point.
So in 2008, the recession really just drastically changed the newspaper industry. Advertisers were forced to pull out of their budgets with print publications for cheaper online options. Advertisers didn't have to pay $3,000 for a full page ad. Instead, they could pay per click on, Google's website. And after the newspaper industry lost their advertising revenue, they had no revenue from participants and readers. So they were forced to transition in some respect. And their transition into online spaces was really rocky for the first 5 years or so. Now, obviously, we see CNN, USA Today, New York Times, all of these really large media outlets who have huge followings online, but it wasn't the case back then.
Great, thank you so much, Lily. Well, certainly this presentation cuts to both journalism, politics, our kind of entire political society in many ways. So great work, Lily. And we will now go on to our next presenter, who is Vas Kumar. And Vas worked with Irina Raiku, the Director of Internet Ethics at the Markkula Center. And Vas is a sociology major from Silicon Valley. Vas, over to you.
Thank you, David, and hello everyone for being here. So this past year, I've been looking at ethical issues in smart cities, specifically the smart city programs in San Jose. And in the next 5 minutes, I'll probably say the words smart city many, many times. So I hope you stay with me for all of that. To start off, smart city seems like a vague term, but also precise to explain what it really means. But what I've found through my research to really define smart cities is that there's no standard or comprehensive definition of the term. Different tech companies and municipal governments interpret it according to their needs and requirements. But overarchingly, the concept does share something at its core, which is the use of technology and the belief that technology can make cities more efficient, safer, and more sustainable. And beyond this emphasis on technology, which all smart city projects share, the development of them as it exists on the ground is filtered through specific political economies and cultures of the place where smart cities exist. So it's very, very contextual. But another thing they hold in common is sensors. The most common technology in smart cities is sensors. These sensors can measure noise level, traffic, air pollution, and much more. And through some of these sensors, smart cities are able to obtain massive amounts of data to help a government make decisions. For example, massive amounts of data on crime has been used by police departments to help them decide which areas of a city to patrol to a greater extent. So this is what I kind of researched about smart cities as a background, and I learned it mostly through academic articles and technology experts. But outside of school, I'm also a community organizer. So something I deeply, deeply value is everyday people's perspectives. And I kind of wanted to bring in qualitative sociology into the mix. To paraphrase Dr. DeCosse, something he said to me in the fall, I think, whether or not people are academics or read philosophy, they still have an ethical code that characterizes how they think through issues. So for my year-long project, I engaged in conversation with 6 San Jose residents to learn about their perspectives on smart cities. Specifically, I reached out to people who are most impacted by smart city development, but whose voices are often left out in mainstream discourse, which is poor and working class people of color, because the goal of my project was really to highlight the depth of their marginalized experiences and insights. So here's what I learned in my conversations with these folks. Building trust with marginalized communities is extremely, extremely crucial, and that responsibility is on local public officials. The residents I spoke with did not believe that city government had their best practices in mind when it came to smart city development. You might ask why? The answer these folks gave me is that they're not even part of public decision-making processes. Folks I talked to said that San Jose municipal government is not transparent with decision-making and technology policies. We don't know how our data is being used. We don't know who's collecting it when it comes to city-level governance, and folks don't think they can trust their local public officials. The next most significant thing I learned is that Silicon Valley tech companies are viewed as fundamentally linked to city government. The private and public are fundamentally linked in the minds of many San Jose residents. This is usually because the city contracts its technology needs to tech companies. It's not a public process, it's outsourced to a private actor. So residents I spoke with referred to quote unquote backroom deals because these companies and local public officials work together behind closed doors. So for these folks, smart city projects are less about the community and more about profits for these companies. The next theme in my results was policing, especially after the Black Lives Matter protests of last year. Policing is something that came up across all 6 of my interviews with local residents. And that's not by accident, and it's not a coincidence. San Jose's Smart City Vision mentions predictive policing and increased policing as a very first bullet point on its Smart City Vision. One resident said in particular, "When I look at a smart city, to me, it looks like a marketing campaign for turning the city into a police state." I've been talking at you for 4 minutes now, so here's a one sentence takeaway summary. According to these residents, smart cities are presented as a tool to fix inequality and make cities a level playing field. Instead, they reproduce inequality. With all these problems, I asked in my interviews, what's next? How do we move on? These folks said that one of the best ways to ensure that people feel served by smart city projects is to put people at the center of them. Instead of prioritizing predictive policing, surveillance, or even real estate, local public officials should start with technology projects that build trust. Suggestions that I got were food insecurity and the digital divide. Another recommendation that came directly from residents is that communities should be able to maintain control over their data and its uses. The best way to move forward is to prioritize community control, community feedback, and community education. The community ought to be in the center. And that's kind of it. Thank you so much for your time.
Vas, thank you so much for unveiling this world in which we all live, even if we're not aware of it, and its ethical implications, especially for marginalized communities. Vas, can you tell us, you mentioned sensors, like these things that are all around. What is one sensor that you think people don't know about that they ought to know about that has real practical and ethical significance?
Yeah. Something I found out, I've been researching smart cities, especially San Jose programs, for the entire year. I learned this 4 weeks ago. In San Jose, the city government has contracted, there's evidence of contracts. We don't know if the project actually happened because that's how much transparency there is. We know there's evidence of contracts, but not if it actually happened. On local streetlights, there are potentially cameras because they're sensors. So the streetlights turn on only when there's someone there, and that's what we know. But embedded in them is also a camera, which people should know about. If there's a camera in their community, they ought to know about it. It shouldn't be hidden as a sensor that is sensing movement for light. These sensors also measure noise, which helps police departments detect activity, but they're also biased in that they don't detect noise perfectly. So it can increase policing in neighborhoods with Black and brown people and harm them to greater extents. Yeah, it's really hard to find all of this information, but I would encourage everyone watching to kind of think of any potential impact of technology. If you're thinking about it, you should Google it because someone's thought about it and written about it. There's so much in this world for sure.
Well, Vas, thank you so much for digging into all this stuff and bringing it to our attention. So way to go. So let's go to our next speaker. And this is going to be Zachary Heffron. And Zach worked this year with Ann Skeet, the Director of Leadership and Business Ethics at the Markkula Center. And Zach is a business marketing major from Seattle, Washington. Zach, over to you.
Thank you, David. And I was screaming at penalty kicks about an hour ago, so please stick with me with my hoarse voice. So I began this year during the application process and the first meetings with my great advisor, Ann Skeet, out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Black Lives Matter movement. And the thing I was really focused on was an idea of complacency and the role that they played. And then we got back to campus in September. I moved nearby campus, living with a house of friends. And there was a sudden movement of students on the kind of the Greek life side of campus towards parties. And this really struck a nerve with me. I'm a part of Greek life, technically, even though I've kept my distance this year. And I saw a lot of my friends going out and being at these 100-person parties, being the cause of large COVID-19 outbreaks near Thanksgiving and in mid-January. So me and my advisor, Ann Skeet, went through a slow and kind of painful process to metamorphosize this project into what it was. And I think it really stemmed out of frustrations for me. And I wanted to know why my friends and why the students that I go to class with on the other side of the campus were ignoring COVID-19 regulations and seemed to be having no care for the toll this pandemic has taken and the threat of spreading the disease. So I interviewed 10 students who have all lived near campus this year, and they've been spread around between Greek life, athletics, the Greek row side of campus, and the other side known affectionately as dark side. And I worked with these students to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, working through their decision-making and picking out singular decisions where they worked through an ethical process, and I guided them through it. And my preliminary findings from these 10 interviews was that students were not concerned with their own health risk when it came to COVID-19. Across the board, students didn't feel threatened by COVID-19. Nobody wanted to get it, but there was no real care about whether they did or didn't. However, this lack of care for themselves was very substituted with a care for others, which was rather surprising to me. And every student I talked to had a deep care about spreading it. They felt guilt or they felt worry that they could spread it and be the cause of somebody else's suffering. And so I tried to dig deeper with each of the interviewees I talked to about what ground this responsibility towards others. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that it affected older people much more heavily than it did younger people. And so many students, especially those who were staying home for spring quarter and were around their families and grandparents, not necessarily by choice, but by necessity, felt a responsibility from that towards their family members, towards their grandparents, and felt a real responsibility of having to take care about what they're doing in order that they don't put their loved ones at risk. And it seemed that every student had that carry over into being at school. Even though they were around young people, they still had this care for the people outside of students, care about their families, care about their friends' families, because they knew they would want the same care given towards their family members. However, students that I interviewed often saw SCU, the campus, as a bubble where COVID-19 could spread among students, but it had a low chance of getting out at grocery stores or to families. And I think this really drove many of them to try and get back to normal. And this was a very interesting process for me because, again, I come from a lot of frustration towards my friends, and it's been very weird to grapple with what I do now with people who I really care about and who care about me, but my judgment of their moral standing is different now than it was a year ago. So it was interesting to find that students still had some ethical framework they were working with, even though it wasn't the one I maybe would have picked. So thank you very much, and go Coes.
Thank you very much, Zach. So, I mean, this is just, plunging into our time. And I know I'm so struck when you talk about the project and being a bit reductionist here, but emerging from your frustrations. And I think those frustrations, there was a lot of emotional and ethical energy and information in those frustrations and all. So, Zach, how might we approach education differently to invite students to think more consistently about actions and their effect on others in their families? And let's face it, with COVID, you don't have to know someone to pass this virus on to them. What could we do differently in terms of ethics to invite that more profound and abiding awareness of others?
Yeah, and this was originally going to be the topic that I wanted to dive into, was what can we change? What are the conditions that inspired students who did respect COVID restrictions? And sadly, I think that'll be kind of post work. But as far as I can tell now, I think that students had to really push and pull, and they wanted to get back to normal. I think normal for them was kind of waiting outside the door. A lot of students moved back to campus, and even if they weren't going out to parties, they still got to live with their friends, myself included, and it was a very big help for me. I think a lot of students were balancing their mental health and their want for normalcy with the care that they owed to other people. And I think that their want for their own interests oftentimes outweighed their rationality. I think it showed that every student cared about not spreading it around to people outside the college campus. But I don't think many of them made decisions either with full information or with full knowledge of the consequences. And I think it was more an aspect of not wanting to know the full information or hiding it from themselves to give justification to their actions rather than a lack of care or ethics. So I don't totally know what that comes to next, but I think it has something to do with balancing self-interest with your obligation to others.
Well, Zach, it may be a little of a tall order to ask you to prescribe what we should do next, but your work has certainly given us a lot of information to think about how we might think about that and structure that. So excellent job on some, to say the least, contemporary and significant stuff.
Thank you very much.
Yes. All right. So we will go to our next speaker, and this is Fernanda Gaete, and we're shifting focus a little bit now. Fernanda and our next speaker after Fernanda, Julia, have focused a bit more specifically on some campus matters and will take us into their work in that area. So Fernanda, over to you, please.
Thank you, Professor DeCosse. I'm very excited to get to share. So Julia and I got to work specifically on projects that would impact our campus and our campus ethics. So again, I'm Fernanda, I'm a finance major, and I'm excited that I got to kind of dive into ethics more. It's something that I was inspired to kind of pursue through my required business ethics class through the business curriculum. So I think that was really great. And I'd like to first kind of talk about why I joined Hackworth and how my project came to be. So originally I applied for the Hackworth Fellowship knowing that I wanted to tell stories. I grew up traveling a lot. My parents traveled for work, so we were expats in 5 different countries before I turned 10 years old. So whenever I met people or whenever I had to introduce myself, I always had that as my fun fact. And as I started to meet a lot of new people in college, I noticed that there were a lot of really amazing people that I met who were fascinating individuals who felt like they didn't have those fun facts or those stories to tell. So what I wanted to do was to teach people that even the nuances of their lives can become the greatest stories. They just have to know how to tell them. And when I joined the program, I was in the process of doing a ton of internship interviews, and I saw a strong intersection between being prepared to present oneself in the context of an interview with how ethics can be a huge aid in how we present our authentic selves. So I wanted to create a product that would help students hit the ground running in their interview prep early on in their college career. So I'm aiming my resource towards first and second year students. And essentially my idea that I'm presenting is that preparing for an interview is not just knowing about the ins and outs of the company that you're applying for, but also knowing the ins and outs of yourself as a person. So my guide explores the authentic self in the context of an interview in 4 main areas of focus. We have confidence, background and culture, as well as values and storytelling. So I'll briefly touch on what this means in the context of the resource. So in terms of background and culture, I focus on how embracing one's background and where you come from is a great way to show more vulnerability in an interview beyond the experiences that are on someone's resume. And in that section, we also look at what it means to be a thoughtful member of a workplace, because as we all know, a perfectly ethical workplace doesn't exist. But as students who are entering the workforce, we can positively impact the places that we work by educating ourselves on topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And moving to the values section, I talk about how making an interview conversational can be so beneficial. And one can do this by having a deep enough understanding of their personal values in order to make a connection with their interviewer about their values. And it becomes a conversation that the interviewer doesn't want to end, so they want to talk to you afterwards. In terms of storytelling, I talk about the importance of having a collection of stories ready to tell through the lens of any interview question, and how storytelling is a way to kind of show one's personal values without having to explicitly say them. And finally, the confidence section touches on the importance of confidence in being a strong leader and a strong interviewee, while also connecting these topics to what it means to be an ethical leader. So my biggest goal with this resource was essentially to create a starting point for students to learn about the authentic self through the lens of ethics. And to do this, every single section that I just mentioned uses QR codes to easily connect students with Markkula Center resources related to these topics, offering these students a super quick and simple way to interact with resources that they might have never previously come across. So my hope is that with this resource, all students will be able to begin this journey of better understanding their authentic self and learn to present themselves in the best light possible as they work to begin their careers in any field. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Fernanda, thank you so much. And I also wanted to say that both Fernanda and Julia, our next speaker, have worked this year with Thor Wasbaden, our managing director at the Markkula Center. Sorry, Thor, for not noting that a few moments ago. So Fernanda, this fascinating project, combining things, I'm thinking as I listen to you speak, in ethics, self-love can be really a problem. We love ourselves too much, or it can be really a great thing. It sounds like you may tilt a little bit more toward the latter, that we need to recover an appropriate sense of self-love as a way to kind of capture our confidence in presenting ourselves to the world. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think so. And I think beyond self-love, I think it's the ability to know oneself well enough to be vulnerable in situations that tend to be scary. I know I'm an advisor to a lot of first and second year students, and they're always very intimidated by the aspect of kind of talking about themselves, because it can feel kind of like we're taking too much time out of an interview, for example, to talk about ourselves, because we're not used to that in society. We're kind of taught to make sure we're leaving time for others. So I think that it's a good reminder that it's beneficial to invest time in the self and time in understanding oneself for the bigger goal of contributing positively to the world around us.
Well, Fernanda, thank you for your great work and sharing this resource with us at the Ethics Center. So, and with other students at Santa Clara, this will be a very helpful way for people to approach something that can be really frightening and challenging, but super important. And also, thank you so much. And we will now go on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Julia Jenak. And Julia, as I mentioned, worked with Thor Wasbatten, our managing director at the Ethics Center. And Julia is an environmental science major from Boulder, Colorado. Julia, over to you. And actually, before I say this, Julia, and you get going, I also want to invite any other questions people listening have. Please post them to the question section in Zoom here, and we can circle back to some of those questions, either specifically for students or for the group at large. All right, Julia, sorry, but thank you, and over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. DeCosse. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. I want to thank Thor, who served as a great mentor to me throughout this entire time as a Hackworth Fellow, and as well thank the Hackworth family and everyone on the Hackworth team. It's been such a treat to hear finally about the final stages of everyone's projects. So when I was first getting brought onto the Hackworth team, we learned a lot about the framework for ethical decision making, which is sort of this. It serves as an introduction to thinking ethically through decisions that people are making. And so through this framework, it sort of guides you in identifying an ethical problem, deliberating about what the potential solutions to address that problem might be, and then acting to address those solutions. And so using this framework as my guide, I was able to identify ethical problems that I saw occurring on our campus. And as part of the campus ethics team, I wanted to find some way to act on and address these problems, not only as myself as an individual, but to sort of inspire other people to address these problems as well. And so what I decided to do to address different ethical issues that I observed was to create a podcast series that featured conversations between myself and another student, close friend or close classmate on campus. And so to start out with, I thought critically about the ethical issues that I really wanted to address. And those were how students define what allyship means to them, and how to avoid performative actions, especially in this virtual world that we're all living in. Another issue that I observed was the casual use of harmful language between peers on campus. And then another one for me, as an environmental science major, as someone who's really passionate about food and agriculture, the stigmatization of food and housing insecurity among students on campus. So I observed these problems and then thought critically about who I wanted to engage in these conversations with. And I decided to engage in these conversations with close friends of mine, or people that I had worked with closely either in the classroom or in extracurricular opportunities at the university. And so in this way, I was setting myself up to be really comfortable in conversation with people, that I could make a mistake, that I could speak wrongly or expose my ignorance about a topic, and that it would be forgiving, and that my mistake could be corrected, and it would be this really productive and forgiving conversation. And so I started a lot of these conversations referencing specific instances that I had observed or experienced on campus, books that I had read, different events that had happened on campus, and really launched into the conversations that way. And so through these conversations, we were able to dive into these topics and discuss, again, going back to the framework, what the issue was, what the actions we saw were potential ways to address the issue, and then how we wanted to move forward in addressing that issue, or in encouraging or inspiring our peers to do the same thing. And so the result of these conversations is, again, like I said, a series of podcast episodes that the goal of them is to exemplify what these conversations can look like and spark conversations just as a result of what people hear happening in the conversation in the recorded podcast. So that students really feel like they have a lot of tools in their tool belt going into these conversations that they might want to engage in with their peers. And so they have the framework for ethical decision making that is clearly highlighted in one of the podcast episodes. And then they have these subsequent podcast episodes that exemplify how people can work through that framework in conversation, in action. And so these episodes will be available in the coming weeks. And I'm hoping that they inspire a lot of students to engage in conversations about ethical issues that they're observing, so that they feel really empowered and motivated to affect the change that they want to see in their community. So at this point, I'll take any questions that people might have. Thanks so much.
Julia, thank you for diving into these really hard issues that we're all living with in a very kind of real daily way. So just a question for you. And we think of ethics, I think, often as, either rules, norms that may be a little fuzzy, but still fairly clear. Sometimes we think that way. But from what you're saying, do we need to make more room in our discussion of ethics on campus for making mistakes, for stumbling, for forgiveness, for getting it wrong? Do we need to or not? What do you think?
I think so, because I think the alternative is that too many students feel nervous and anxious to even start talking about it. And so if there's this level of fear and anxiety about what the repercussions could be, social repercussions could be if you say the wrong thing, then students have this, limited motivation to even speak up about these problems they're observing in the first place. It was really interesting in the first conversation I had about allyship. I was speaking with someone who I felt confident that they would have a lot to say about allyship and what it meant to them. And we entered the conversation and both of us were equally nervous. I was nervous as someone who's still trying to figure out what allyship means for me. And he was nervous as someone who's also still trying to figure out what it means to him, despite how sort of like confident and seemingly knowledgeable he is about it. And so if everyone is feeling this nervousness and anxiety, then to create an environment where there's a little bit of wiggle room to make mistakes and own your voice, own your mistakes, own your ignorance, and learn with each other, then I think that's the most powerful thing. And I'm hoping that that's what these podcasts will exemplify too, is that, I'm not speaking perfectly and I don't have a good idea of everything I'm talking about out of home. Like, this is not in my comfy, cozy place of environmental science and agriculture, like are out of that comfortable place for me. So I'm hoping that people will see that if you're doing it with someone who you trust and have a foundational relationship with, that to engage in those conversations, it can be productive.
Julia, thank you so much. And so a couple of questions have come in, and actually a couple right away for Julia, and then we'll circle back. There's another one here. And so I invite audience questions to all of our great fellows here. That completes all of the presentations. So now we can move into a time for some follow-up questions. So Julia, let me pose this question to you from Rena Raiku, our Director of Internet Ethics. I love Julia's phrasing about productive and forgiving conversations. How might we encourage, create space for more of those, even if it's not with our friends? Julia, what do you think?
The first thing that comes to mind is, and I've been thinking a lot about this in a lot of the different conversations that I had, but I think that the pandemic has made encouraging this and creating these spaces more challenging because of the nature of conversations and comments and statuses and the way that people engage with each other and speak with each other over the internet. I think I thought a lot about sort of cancel culture and what that looks like, and feared that myself in sharing these online. But I think that if we're going to encourage and create space for that, in a way, it has to be in person through personal connections with other people. It doesn't have to be, but I think it's so much easier if to create those spaces in person, much more challenging to happen in a virtual environment. And so that's something that has been hard for me to sort of think about and see. And I think something that's powerful about the university and creating all the seminar studies and the spaces that professors on campus. I think in terms of how I've found it that those spaces with other people is bringing up things that are happening out of the class, conversations with other people, whether you're friends or not, and it makes it so much easier to dive into specific instances in which is being exemplified, in which that's being discussed, and then use those as jumping off points for discussion. Encourage among people is to be more observant of those instances so that they can use them as jumping off points to sort of fuel their conversations.
Julia, thank you so much. We had a slight connection issue. I don't know, there's something happening, I think, with your connection, but we caught 80% of what you just said, and it was awesome. So.
Okay, that's good to know. Sorry about that.
No worries. This is the time when those things happen. So let me shift to a question here. This is for both Julian and Amana. And the question is, I would like to hear Julian and Amana talk about medical deception. Amana is trying to build trust in medicine, while Julian has found a place where care bots can lie to people. What should we make of this difference? Amana, would you like to take that one first, please?
Yeah, I can definitely jump in. So kind of my first thought in this is like, I think Julian's project is kind of the perfect example of why there's still this contemporary idea of medical mistrust, because there still are instances where things like deception are happening. And so I think for me, when it comes to talking about race and kind of healthcare disparities from that aspect, there needs to be a very focused effort on mediating these concerns and an extra step taken by healthcare providers to ensure that patients are able to put trust in their providers and kind of rebuild these issues that have built up over time for numerous instances, such as coming from historical issues to contemporary experiences of their family members. And there's just so many things in healthcare disparities and this mistrust in medical systems is something that's very founded. And so one thing that in my project is there's two truths when it comes to it. Both science and history are equal truths. But I think it's also, I know a lot of us have played a game called Two Truths and a Lie. And so then you throw in misinformation as the lie, and that has such a big impact on the other two. And so I think living in this age of social media, we see just even in our individual projects and kind of how they all fall together, there's so much intertwining between them all. And so then kind of coming into the social media side and the journalism side of misinformation and how information is being portrayed in this time, medical deception is something that's so easy to occur because anyone can put whatever out on the internet. And there's always going to be someone who believes it. And I think that's a lot of where we've seen a lot of medical mistrust in the face of COVID-19. And so like one thing my dad has said kind of throughout the pandemic is like, you can't always trust your uncle at the barbecue. And so it's important to know where you're getting your information from, and it's not someone without credentials. And so I think the people with credentials need to kind of have their voice out there. And I found some awesome resources that will be shared through my deliverables from this fellowship that have been great and very pivotal for me specifically, and I think for others as well.
Thank you so much, Amana. And let me just restate the question for the audience here. So Amana is trying to build trust in medicine while Julian has found a place where care bots can lie to people. Julian, what should we make of this difference?
Yeah, so I think Amana made a really good distinction between like deception on the broad scale and deception on the individual scale. Where I think that deception is definitely wrong is this kind of medical misinformation or large scale lying to people. Where I see a place for deception, and albeit a very narrow place, is when it can create an overall better circumstance for the patient than perhaps creating an overall worse situation. So, for example, going back to that case that I touched on briefly in my presentation about an older adult whose parents have long passed away. However, they're demented and they're asking for their parents. And maybe we know that this older adult, when they ask for their parents and the caregiver tells them, oh, I'm sorry, but your mom and dad have died, they get really agitated, they get really sad, they get depressed. If we know that when the care bot answers honestly that the patient will have a negative outcome, we can use deception in order to create a better outcome for them by perhaps not answering or just saying, oh, your mom will be coming later. And so that the patient doesn't have this negative outcome that we know that is going to happen. But like I said in my presentation earlier, like deception should be used very carefully, because when it is used too much, it leads to creation of distrust between medical providers, perhaps care bots, and their patients. So there's really a very high bar for using deception in medicine. And again, what I talked about in my project was that that bar is reached when there's a low or small influence on the care outcome, and also the patient has a low cognitive capacity. So just to kind of conclude, deception should rarely be used, but when it is allowed to be used, it's used in order to benefit the patient.
Thank you so much, Julian. Very clear presentation of that utilitarian calculus. So we have another question here for Amana. And so Amana, the question is, what is one key strategy that you used when creating your infographic that you believe will directly work to decrease the medical mistrust currently found in the Black community?
Yeah, I love that question. So I kind of touched on this a little bit in my last response, but one thing, my project, just because it's been very fluid in the sense that the pandemic has been occurring at the same time that I've been doing this project and researching, but also my deliverable has changed time and time again, just to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can. And one idea that had originally kind of been what my deliverable would be a website kind of answering all of these questions about like the vaccine and trying to help build that trust. And then in the last month or two, I ended up finding a website. It's called The Conversation Between Us and Within Us. And it is a group of Black physicians who are answering all questions COVID related, all the questions that are hard to ask, hard to answer, all of those things in one place. And so that was kind of one strategy that I think my infographic employs, by kind of promoting that resource and kind of taking some of those ideas and videos and things that they have already started to kind of broadcast and use as a modality for decreasing the medical mistrust, by answering those questions from people who look like the patients of the population that we're getting to. And so I think there's definitely a certain element of having a doctor that looks like you that helps build trust. And so that was one thing, even with the statistics that I talked about on my slide, is people were twice as likely to get the vaccine if they believed that the Black community was taken into account in vaccine trials. And so that's one piece that I think has made a big difference in my research. And rather than reinventing the wheel, it was definitely much better to promote this wheel rather than using my undergraduate voice. I kind of piggybacked off the credibility of this group of phenomenal physicians.
Well, Amana, we're not going to say you don't have a great undergraduate voice that people need to hear, because you've demonstrated that. So, well, thank you all so much. We don't have any more questions, so I'm going to go over to Don Hyder, the Executive Director of the Ethics Center, for a few words, and before we say goodnight. Don.
Thank you, David. Wow, what a great night. Thank you all so much. Thanks for everybody who came. It's a lot calmer than watching a shootout for Santa Clara women's soccer, although it had a good outcome. But I agree with David. You see incredible hope here in these students and the incredible work they're doing, and for what they're going to do once they leave here. And you know, I have a new favorite quote. And that I've just adopted, which has been around a long time, and a lot of you have already heard it, I'm sure. But Martin Luther King wrote, "The time is always right to do what is right." And I think these students absolutely personified that tonight in the work they're doing this semester. So thank you all for being with us. And if you want to know more about the Markkula Center, visit our website at just and we're happy to answer any other questions you have about the work we do with students or with the campus or professionals out in the community. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Don. And with that, we conclude our Hackworth Fellow Showcase for the 2021 academic year. And you know, to all of the fellows, thank you so much for just being on tonight and your great presentations. It's been on behalf of the center. I want to thank all the fellows. It's always sort of our joy, privilege to work with all of you. And we look forward to seeing you in the next weeks and to staying in touch. And thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in for this great series of presentations. So with that, good night from the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And we look forward to being in touch with all of you in the year ahead. Good night.